Hello, thank you for joining me today. This video tells the complete story of Frank Horrigan, from his troubled beginnings to his final moments on the Enclave oil rig. You have probably heard his name whispered in wasteland stories, seen him referenced as the ultimate boss battle, maybe even wondered if the legends about a 12-foot mutant in black armor could possibly be true. They are true, all of them, and the reality is somehow worse than the legend. This is the story of how a psychologically unstable Secret Service agent became the Enclave's ultimate weapon, how years of FEV exposure and brutal experimentation transformed him into something barely human, how he murdered his way across the California wasteland, leaving a trail of bodies that included children, families, and anyone the Enclave classified as impure, and how one tribal, armed with determination and unlikely allies, finally brought down the most powerful mutant in Fallout history. This is not just Frank's story, it is a warning about what happens when organizations decide some lives do not matter, when loyalty becomes more important than morality, when we create monsters and convince ourselves we are heroes. And if you genuinely enjoy this kind of dark storytelling, consider subscribing and liking the channel, but only if it truly resonates with you. I need to tell you something, not because I want to, but because someone has to remember what happened before the records are lost. Before the desert swallows everything whole, my name does not matter. What matters is what I saw, what I witnessed in those final days before the oil rig went up in flames. You have heard stories about monsters, I am sure. Ghouls shambling through irradiated streets, super mutants crushing skulls with bare hands, deathclaws tearing through power armor like paper. But those things, those creatures, they are products of chance and chaos. What I am going to tell you about is different. This is about something deliberate, something crafted with purpose and precision. This is about Frank Horrigan. Before I go further, I need you to understand something fundamental about the Enclave. They called themselves the last hope of America, the pure strain of humanity that would reclaim the wasteland. But purity, real purity, it became an obsession that twisted into something darker. They looked at the world outside their sterile corridors and saw only contamination, only mistakes that needed correcting. And when you see the world that way, when you convince yourself that you alone hold the blueprint for humanity's future, you will do anything to protect that vision. Anything. Frank Horrigan was not born a monster. Let me make that clear from the start. In 2211, he came into this world as human as you or me, though even then he was different. Larger than other children, broader in the shoulders, with hands that could crush walnuts before he turned 10. His parents, whoever they were, must have seen something unsettling in those early years. A boy who grew too fast, who smiled when other children cried, who did not seem to understand why you should not hurt smaller things. The Enclave noticed him young. Of course they did. They noticed everything. Their talent scouts watched children in the controlled environment of the oil rig, measuring physical traits, cognitive abilities, psychological markers. They were looking for soldiers, you see. Not just any soldiers, but perfect instruments of their will. And Frank, with his size and his strength, and his remarkably uncomplicated mind, he fit a very specific profile. By his early 20s, Frank had already climbed higher than men twice his age. The Secret Service, the personal guard of President Dick Richardson himself. Can you imagine that? A man, barely past boyhood, standing outside the office where the fate of the wasteland was decided. He wore the uniform. He carried the weapons. He stood at attention for hours without complaint. In that role, in that rigid structure, his peculiarities almost looked like virtues. His size intimidated. His single-minded focus seemed like loyalty. His difficulty with complex thought appeared as dedication to simple, clear orders. But there were incidents, whispers in the barracks, reports that never made it into official files. A training exercise where Frank broke another agent's arm in 3 places and kept twisting until someone pulled him off. A security drill where he beat a simulated intruder unconscious and then kept beating. The Enclave psychologists made their notes, adjusted their medications, recommended increased supervision. They knew what he was. They just thought they could control it. The psychotic blunder, as they called it in hushed tones, happened sometime in 2236. I never learned the full details. The official records were scrubbed, burned, deleted from every database. But I heard fragments over the years, a perceived threat to the president that was not a threat at all, a reaction wildly disproportionate to the situation, blood on the walls of a corridor that took 3 days to clean, and Frank, standing in the middle of it all, confused why everyone was screaming, unable to understand what he had done wrong. They could have executed him. Any other organization would have, but the Enclave does not waste resources, and Frank was a resource. So instead of a bullet, he got a transfer. Wasteland patrol duty, they called it. A punishment dressed up as a reassignment. Out there, beyond the safety of the oil rig, beyond the sterile halls where civilized men made civilized decisions about uncivilized acts. Out there, his violent tendencies could be useful. The patrols were brutal work. Not because of what you faced in the wasteland, though that was dangerous enough. Raiders, mutants, radiation storms that could cook you inside your power armor. No, the patrols were brutal because of what you were ordered to do. The Enclave needed slaves, you see. Bodies to dig through the ruins of old-world facilities, to extract resources, to handle materials too dangerous for valuable Enclave personnel. And Wasteland Patrol, that was where you found those bodies. Frank took to the work with disturbing enthusiasm. Other soldiers came back from those missions hollow-eyed, drinking too much, having nightmares about the families they had dragged screaming from settlements. Frank came back eager for the next assignment. He did not see people when he looked at wastelanders. He saw muties, contaminants, things that looked like humans, but were not quite human enough to matter. It was easier for him that way, simpler. In July of 2236, the Enclave made a discovery that would change everything. Scouts found the ruins of Mariposa military base, buried under tons of rubble and radiation, still holding secrets from before the bombs fell. Inside those ruins, deep in the collapsed levels, the forced evolutionary virus waited. FEV. The thing that created super mutants, that twisted human DNA into something unrecognizable. The Enclave wanted it, needed it. Their plans for reclaiming the world required understanding that virus, controlling it, weaponizing it. So they sent in the excavation teams, and they sent soldiers to round up slaves to do the digging. Frank was part of one of those squads. I try to imagine what it must have been like, watching him move through settlements with his squad behind him. Did people try to run? Did they beg? It would not have mattered. Frank was very good at his job, very efficient. He would grab someone by the arm, and that person became cargo, property, a tool to be used and discarded. If they resisted, well, there are many ways to hurt someone without killing them. Frank knew all of them. By September, the excavation was in full swing. Slaves and Enclave construction crews working side by side in the ruins, pulling away debris, drilling deeper into the mountain. And that was when the mutations started. The base had been sealed but not dead. FEV does not die easily. It lingers in the air, in the soil, in the groundwater. The slaves, unprotected, began changing almost immediately. Skin thickening, bones elongating, minds simplifying. They were becoming super mutants, second-generation ones, less stable than the originals but just as dangerous. Frank was down there when it happened, supervising the work, making sure the slaves kept digging, kept moving. He was not wearing full environmental protection. Why would he? He was Enclave, and Enclave soldiers were supposed to be tougher than wasteland trash. The regulations said protective gear, but regulations also said a lot of things that got ignored when they were inconvenient. I wonder if he felt it. That first moment when the virus entered his lungs, slipped into his bloodstream, began rewriting him at the cellular level. Did he notice the burning sensation, the way his heart started racing? Or was he too focused on his duties, too simple to recognize what was happening to his own body? What do you think really happened there? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I would like to know if I am the only one who feels this way. The Enclave pulled him out fast once they realized what had happened. Frank Horrigan, exposed to pure FEV, already showing signs of mutation. In any sane world, they would have put him down like they put down infected slaves. But the Enclave saw something else, an opportunity, a chance to study the virus in a controlled subject. Someone they already had files on, someone whose baseline they knew. They brought him back to the oil rig and handed him over to the scientists, to Dr. Charles Curling and his chemical core team. Men who saw human beings as data points, as variables in equations they were trying to solve. Frank became their primary test subject, not because he volunteered, but because he no longer had a choice. The virus was changing him, and the Enclave was going to document every second of that change. For 2 years, Frank existed in a nightmare of sedation and surgery. They kept him unconscious most of the time because when he woke up, incidents occurred. Bloodshed, the reports called it. Major bloodshed. The virus was making him stronger, faster, larger, But it was also stripping away what little self-control he had possessed. The man who had struggled to understand social boundaries was becoming something that did not recognize boundaries at all. Curling and his team did not just observe. They experimented, modified strains of FEV, injected directly into Frank's system to see what would happen. Surgical enhancements, cybernetic implants grafted onto mutating tissue, organ modifications, genetic therapies, treatments that would have killed anyone else. But Frank survived. His body, already massive before the virus, grew larger still. His bones thickened. His muscles became dense as steel cables. His skin developed a texture somewhere between leather and stone. The conditioning started during those 2 years as well. Psychological programming, they called it. Presidential directive. They could not make Frank smarter. The virus had damaged what little intelligence he possessed. But they could make him more obedient, more focused, more single-minded in his loyalty. Drugs, hypnotic suggestion, pain compliance training. They broke him down and rebuilt him as a weapon that would point exactly where they wanted. I saw the medical reports once, smuggled them out of a restricted archive because I needed to understand what they had created. The details were clinical, detached. Subject exhibits continued cellular growth. Muscle density increased by 340%. Bone structure reinforced through FEV-induced calcium deposition. Synaptic response enhanced, but higher cognitive functions remained suppressed. It read like a technical manual, as if they were describing a piece of equipment instead of what had once been a man. By January of 2239, they ran out of tests. Frank had been pushed to every limit they could measure, and he kept surviving, kept getting stronger. The question became what to do with him. You cannot just store something like that in a cell forever. It needs to be used, needs to serve a purpose. And the Enclave, as always, had purposes in mind. On March 27, 2239, Frank Horrigan was manufactured for his new role. Manufactured, not assigned. That was the word they used in the internal memos. He was no longer considered human enough to receive assignments. He was a product, a tool, a weapon system being deployed into the field. They built him custom power armor, not the kind you or I might wear, but something unique, something designed specifically for a body that no longer fit human proportions. 12 feet tall when fully sealed. Advanced composite plating that could shrug off plasma fire. A back-mounted, microfusion reactor to power it all, because normal power cells could not handle the energy requirements. And here is the truly horrifying part. The armor was not something Frank wore. It was something he was grafted into, fused with at multiple points. He could not take it off, could not ever be free of it. The armor kept him alive, continuously, injecting him with drugs and stabilizing agents because his mutated biology could not sustain itself without chemical support. They armed him like you would arm a tank, an oversized plasma cannon, modified to fire faster and hit harder than anything else in the wasteland. A serrated combat blade the size of a grown man, sharp enough to cut through power armor, heavy enough to decapitate a deathclaw with a single swing. He was not a soldier anymore. He was a walking artillery piece, a mobile weapon platform with enough firepower to level a small settlement. The field tests were successful, horrifically successful. They sent Frank into situations where normal soldiers would have died, where even a full squad might have struggled. He went in alone and came back victorious, often without a scratch. Raiders fortified in a concrete bunker, dead in minutes. A pack of deathclaws threatening an Enclave supply route, slaughtered to the last creature. A settlement suspected of harboring spies, erased from existence. The Enclave loved him for it, not as a person, but as a solution. They had sticky problems, situations too dangerous or too politically sensitive for normal operations, and Frank was their answer. Send in Horrigan. Let him handle it. Do not ask too many questions about the aftermath. But the soldiers, the men who had to accompany Frank on missions, they hated him, feared him, called him a freak, a walking nuke, something the tech boys had built in a lab. Most refused to work with him if they had any choice in the matter. Not because he was ineffective, but because of how he did the work. The brutality, the obvious enjoyment, the way he would linger over kills when the mission was already complete, experimenting with different ways to hurt things. Frank himself seemed unaware of their feelings, or maybe he just did not care. His world had narrowed to simple concepts. Orders from the president were good. Disobeying orders was bad. Muties were bad. Killing muties was good. Everything else, the complexity of human interaction, the moral weight of his actions, it all existed beyond his capacity to comprehend. I remember seeing him once, early in my time with the Enclave. I was young then, still believed in what we were doing, still thought the ends justified the means. We were on the oil rig, in one of the main corridors, and Frank was being escorted from one lab to another. The hallway, built for normal humans, was barely wide enough for him. He moved with this strange grace despite his size, each step precise and controlled. His helmet turned as he passed, and I swear I saw his eyes through the visor. They were not angry or hateful, they were empty, like looking into a tunnel that goes down forever, no light at the end. One of the older scientists noticed me staring and pulled me aside after Frank had passed. "Do not make eye contact," he said. "Do not speak to him unless he speaks first. And if he does speak to you, answer simply and directly. He is a resource, nothing more. Treat him like you would treat a piece of dangerous equipment. Respect what it can do, but never forget what it is." I asked what he meant by that. The scientist gave me a look, tired and sad. "Here's what happens when we try to play God," he said. "When we take a broken man and break him further in the name of progress. And the worst part? It worked. We got exactly what we wanted. The mainland deployments, that is where Frank truly became legend. Not the good kind of legend, but the kind that parents use to scare children into obedience. Stories filtered back from the wasteland, growing more horrific with each telling. A village wiped out overnight. Every man, woman, and child killed. Even the livestock slaughtered. A caravan ambushed on a trade route. The guards killed so viciously that experienced soldiers threw up looking at the remains. Random encounters with wastelanders who had the misfortune of crossing paths with an Enclave patrol led by a massive figure in black power armor. There was a pattern to the kills, if you knew what to look for. Frank always went for the head. Not a clean shot, but crushing it, pulverizing it, making sure there was nothing left that looked human. The psychologists said it was a coping mechanism, his way of dehumanizing his victims even further. If they did not have faces, they were not really people, just targets, obstacles, things that needed removing. One report, buried deep in classified files, described an incident at a small farming community. Frank's squad had been sent to investigate. Rumors of organized resistance, maybe contact with NCR sympathizers. They found nothing. Just families trying to grow crops in irradiated soil, trying to survive. The squad commander recommended they leave, report back that the settlement was no threat. Frank disagreed. The commander tried to explain that these were not combatants, that the mission parameters did not call for civilian casualties. Frank informed him that all wastelanders were mutants by definition, that contamination from radiation made them less than human, that the president wanted the wasteland cleansed. The commander ordered his men to stand down, not to fire. Frank shot him first, then the soldiers, who looked like they might object. Then he turned on the settlement, alone, methodically, building by building, person by person. The soldiers who survived said it took him 4 hours. 4 hours of sustained killing, and when it was done, nothing moved in that settlement except the wind. The Enclave quietly promoted Frank after that incident. They court-martialed the dead commander for insubordination and ruled the settlement a legitimate military target based on post-action intelligence that was almost certainly fabricated. The message was clear. Frank Horrigan was not to be questioned. His actions, no matter how extreme, had official sanction at the highest levels. I wonder sometimes if President Richardson ever had doubts, if he ever looked at Frank, at what his Enclave had created, and felt regret The man who sent Frank into the wasteland, who signed off on every atrocity, who used that twisted weapon to advance his vision of a pure humanity. Did he understand what he had unleashed? Or was Frank just another necessary evil, another sacrifice on the altar of the greater good? By 2241, Frank was no longer just a soldier or even just a weapon. He was an institution, a symbol of Enclave power. The ultimate foot soldier, they called him in the propaganda. The president's shield, America's avenging angel. But out in the wasteland, where people whispered his name in fear, they called him something else. The devil in black armor, the Enclave's monster, death on two legs. He killed so many, hundreds, maybe thousands. Most of them are not in any official record, just people who were in the wrong place, saw the wrong thing, or simply existed in a way that Frank's damaged mind interpreted as threatening. A trader who ran when he saw Enclave troops, a farmer who reached for a tool Frank mistook for a weapon, a child who screamed too loudly and drew his attention, and through it all, Frank believed he was doing the right thing, serving his country, following orders, protecting the last hope of humanity from contamination. His world was simple, black and white, right and wrong, and in that simplicity, in that absolute certainty, he found a kind of peace that men with working consciences can never achieve. The worst part, the part that kept me awake at night after I learned the truth, is that the Enclave succeeded. They took a psychologically unstable man, a human being with problems that could have been treated or managed, and they transformed him into the perfect instrument of genocide. No mercy, no hesitation, no remorse, just efficient, brutal, unstoppable violence in service of an ideology that saw most of humanity as expendable. Frank Horrigan was not an accident. He was not a mistake. He was a deliberate creation, the logical endpoint of the Enclave's philosophy. And that should terrify you more than any ghoul, any raider, any super mutant ever could. Because monsters that come from chaos and radiation, those you can understand, but monsters that come from careful planning, from laboratories and research and systematic effort to create the most efficient killer possible, those are different. Those are the monsters we make when we forget that some lines should never be crossed. The year 2241 marked a turning point in the Enclave's grand plan, though most of us did not realize it at the time. We were so focused on the work, on the project, on what we believed would be humanity's salvation. FEV Curling 13, named after Dr. Charles Curling himself, had reached its final stages of development, 250,000 gallons of modified virus, refined to kill with extraordinary efficiency. 0.0001% aerosol exposure, that was all it took. Less than an hour for wastelanders. 14.5 hours of agony for vault dwellers with cleaner genetics. Death for everyone who had not been inoculated, which meant death for everyone except us. Frank was assigned to security detail for the final phase. He stood guard outside the laboratories, where Curling and his team worked around the clock, preparing the virus for global deployment. I saw him there often, a motionless statue of black armor and barely contained violence. Sometimes I would walk past and hear breathing through his helmet, heavy and mechanical like a fusion reactor idling. The soldiers joked nervously that you could feel the heat radiating off him from 10 feet away, that his armor was always hot to the touch because the reactor worked overtime keeping his mutated body alive. He never spoke unless spoken to first, never moved unless ordered, but his head would track you as you passed, following your movement with that unsettling precision predators have. I learned to avoid eye contact, to walk quickly, to not exist too loudly in his presence. Most of us did. There was an incident in the commissary one evening. A technician, new to the oil rig, did not know the protocols. He sat at a table where Frank sometimes ate, not realizing that soldiers had an unofficial rule about keeping certain areas clear. Frank entered, saw the technician, and simply stood there, silent, waiting. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The technician, confused, asked if there was a problem. Frank tilted his head, a motion that seemed wrong on something so large. "You are in my space, mutie." The technician started to protest that he was Enclave personnel, fully human, vetted and cleared. Frank took one step forward, just one. The technician scrambled away so fast he overturned his tray. Frank sat down, began eating with mechanical efficiency as if nothing had happened. The technician disappeared from the oil rig within a week. Requested transfer to Navarro, they said. Could not handle the pressure. But we all knew He had looked into those empty eyes and seen what was looking back. I need you to understand the scale of what curling had accomplished. The original FEV, the virus that created super mutants, it required massive exposure and specific conditions. Curling had weaponized it, turned it into an airborne genocide machine. The plan was elegant in its horror. Release it into the jet streams that converged at the oil rig. Let the wind do the work. 2 weeks for global saturation. Only humans and human-based mutants would die. Their glycoproteins binding with the virus, triggering cascade organ failure. Animals, plants, the ecosystem itself would survive, ready for enclave colonization once the bodies stopped piling up. Frank understood none of this complexity. Someone tried to explain it to him once, a scientist who thought maybe Frank deserved to know what he was protecting. Frank listened for maybe 30 seconds before interrupting. President says the muties need to die. I make sure they die. Do not need to know more than that. The scientist persisted, explaining that this was not just battlefield casualties, but the systematic extermination of millions. Frank stared at him until the silence became unbearable, then said, "Good. More muties dead means mission accomplished." That was Frank's worldview in its entirety. Orders from the president were law. Everything outside those orders was irrelevant noise. The scientist never tried to talk to him again. But the wasteland did not forget Frank. Stories spread through trade routes and settlements like radiation sickness. The monster of the enclave, parents threatened misbehaving children with tales of a giant in black armor who came in the night. Raiders, men who made their living through violence, would abandon territory if they heard Frank was operating in the area. Even super mutants, creatures that feared almost nothing, learned to recognize the sound of his armor's servos and would scatter before he arrived. There was a particular encounter that became infamous among those who survived to tell it. August 30th, 2241. Frank and his squad tracked down an elderly farmer, a man whose scientific knowledge from before the war made him valuable. The Enclave wanted him recruited, brought to the oil rig to work on projects that needed his expertise. They sent Frank because they thought his intimidating presence would ensure compliance. The farmer lived with his son and grandson, a small family, trying to maintain a fragment of civilization in the wasteland. When Frank's vertibird landed, the old man came out to meet them, no fear in his eyes. He had survived the bombs. He had watched the world end. What was one more threat? Frank made the offer. Simple terms. Come with us. Work for the Enclave. Help rebuild America. The old man refused. He had heard stories about what happened to people the Enclave recruited. How they disappeared into facilities and never came out. How their knowledge was extracted and their bodies disposed of when they were no longer useful. He said no firmly and clearly. Said his family had survived this long without the Enclave's help and would continue to do so. Frank asked once more, his tone not changing, not showing frustration or anger, just repeating the order as if the old man had simply not heard correctly. The farmer refused again, told Frank to leave his property, to take his soldiers and his machinery, and go back to whatever hole they had crawled out of. He called the Enclave fascists, called them worse than the Chinese, said at least the bombs had been quick. I often wonder what went through Frank's mind in that moment. Did he feel insulted, angry, or was it simpler than that? Just a calculation that the mission had failed and now required a different solution. He turned to his squad and gave the order. 2 words, kill them. The soldiers hesitated. These were not combatants. An old man, his middle-aged son, a child no older than 10. But Frank's orders came with the weight of presidential authority, and hesitation could be interpreted as insubordination, which Frank had been known to resolve with immediate violence. The squad opened fire. The old man died first, shot multiple times before he hit the ground. His son tried to run, made it maybe 20 feet before the bullets found him. The boy, the grandson, he just stood there, frozen, too young to understand what was happening, too terrified to move. Frank walked over to him, plasma cannon still hot from firing. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide and wet with tears. Frank shot him in the chest. Sent a mass. The plasma turned the child into ash and scattered bones before the body hit the dirt. Then Frank turned to his squad and asked, in that flat mechanical voice, if they wanted to check the house for useful supplies before returning to base. Someone witnessed this. A tribal, barely more than a kid himself, hiding in the brush nearby. He watched the whole thing, watched Frank murder a family for the crime of defying the Enclave. That witness had a name, though Frank did not know it then. The Chosen One, his people called him. The grandson of the Vault Dweller. sent on a quest to save his village from drought and famine. He watched Frank commit casual atrocity, and he remembered Frank spared him. Not out of mercy, but out of dismissal. A tribal, primitive and harmless. Contaminated by the wasteland, and therefore beneath notice. Frank told him to move along, to forget what he had seen if he valued his life. Then the vertibird lifted off, leaving 3 bodies and 1 traumatized witness behind. That witness would be Frank's downfall, but not yet. Not for many months. The massacres continued. Frank was deployed to San Francisco, to the Brotherhood of Steel outpost hidden in the city. They had sent an agent named Matthew to infiltrate Navarro, to steal vertibird plans that would give the Brotherhood aerial capability. Matthew succeeded, got the plans, transmitted them back to the outpost. But the Enclave knew. They always knew. Frank was sent to deliver a message. He walked into that outpost alone, no squad for backup. The Brotherhood Knights opened fire immediately. Plasma casters and laser rifles. Weapons that could punch through standard power armor. Frank did not even slow down. He waded through the fire like it was rainfall, bullets and energy blasts sparking off his custom plating. Reached Matthew, who was trying to get to better cover, trying to bring his own weapons to bear. Frank grabbed him by the head, lifted him off the ground with one hand. Matthew shot him point blank with a plasma caster, full charge, right into Frank's chest. Frank laughed, actually laughed, a sound like grinding metal. Then he squeezed. Matthew's helmet crumpled, then his skull. Frank held the body up for a moment longer, making sure everyone in the outpost saw, making sure the message was clear. Then he dropped it and asked his squad, who had been waiting outside, if anyone wanted lunch. The Brotherhood Knights who survived that assault never forgot. They reported back about the monster in black armor, the thing that could not be hurt, could not be stopped. Some of them had nightmares for years afterward. One of them told me, much later, that the worst part was not the violence, it was the casualness of it. Frank had killed their friend and immediately moved on to thinking about food, as if he had just completed a minor chore. Vault 13 was next. The Enclave had raided it once already, taken the human inhabitants for testing with FEV curling 13. They all died, of course, screaming and bleeding and begging for it to stop, while Curling took notes and adjusted formulas. But the vault had been reoccupied by intelligent deathclaws, creatures created by Enclave experiments that had gone rogue. They had formed a community, were learning to read, were trying to build something resembling civilization in the ruins. The Enclave decided this was unacceptable. Deathclaws with intelligence were dangerous, unpredictable. Frank was sent with orders to eliminate them, all of them. He went into that vault and it became an abattoir. The Deathclaws fought back, of course. They were strong, fast, had claws that could shred normal power armor. Against Frank, they might as well have been fighting with their bare hands against a tank. He killed them systematically. The warriors first, then the females, then the young. Goris, the leader of the pack, a Deathclaw who could speak and reason, tried to negotiate, offered to leave, to take his people far away where they would never be a threat. Frank shot him mid-sentence. The security footage showed Frank standing among the bodies afterward, not even breathing hard, checking his ammunition count before moving to the next section of the vault. 37 Deathclaws dead in less than an hour. The Enclave reviewed the footage and called it an exemplary mission. Efficient, clean, no casualties on our side. They gave Frank a commendation and sent him back to the oil rig to prepare for the final phase. If you have ever wondered what choice you would make in a situation like this, tell me in the comments. I will be reading them. The chosen one, that tribal witness from August, he was getting closer. We started hearing reports of someone asking questions about the Enclave, causing trouble at our outposts, freeing slaves, disrupting operations. The intelligence division dismissed it as a nuisance. One person against the full might of the Enclave's remaining forces. But that one person was gathering allies. Brotherhood of Steel, NCR sympathizers, Vault City resources. People who had lost loved ones to Frank's brutality and wanted revenge. They found Vault 13, saw what Frank had done there. The bodies were still fresh, still bleeding. Goris had been a friend to some of them, a thinking being trying to build something better. And Frank had slaughtered him like livestock. That hardened their resolve. This was not just about saving a village anymore. This was about stopping the Enclave before they could deploy their poison. The Enclave was so confident. We had the virus ready, had the dispersal system prepared, had Frank and the other security forces in position. President Richardson gave speeches about the dawn of a new age, about pure humanity reclaiming its birthright. Dr. Curling worked 20-hour days making final adjustments to the formula. ensuring maximum lethality with minimum variance. I remember standing in the observation deck, looking out at the ocean, thinking about what we were about to do. Kill everyone, not just raiders and mutants, but families like the farmer Frank had murdered. Children who had never done anything except try to survive in a world they never made. Old people, sick people, good people, all of them dying in agony because we had decided they were not pure enough to live. Some of us started to have doubts, quiet doubts, the kind you did not voice aloud because doubt was sedition, and sedition was punishable by immediate execution. We would pass each other in corridors and see it in each other's eyes, that question we could not ask. Is this really necessary? Is this really right? But no one spoke, no one acted. We were all complicit, all part of the machine that was about to commit the greatest genocide in human history. Frank had no doubts. Frank never had doubts. He stood his post, followed his orders, waited for the day when he would be unleashed on a world that could not stop him. In his mind, he was saving humanity. In his mind, every person he killed brought America one step closer to rebirth. The virus would finish what he started, eliminate every contaminated human on the planet, and then the Enclave could step out of the shadows and rebuild civilization the right way. But the Chosen One had other plans. In the fall of 2242, he came for us, came for the oil rig, came for everything the Enclave had built. The alarms started in the early hours, not the usual drills we had grown accustomed to, but real alarms, the kind that made your stomach drop and your hands shake. Someone had breached the outer security perimeter. Someone was on the oil rig. I was in the residential sector when it happened, trying to sleep through another night of guilty thoughts and suppressed horror. The klaxons dragged me from bed, and I remember standing in my quarters, still half asleep, thinking this had to be a mistake. Nothing could penetrate our defenses. We were miles offshore, protected by automated systems and veteran soldiers, surrounded by ocean that would kill anyone without proper equipment. The oil rig was supposed to be impenetrable. The announcement came over the intercom. Intruders detected. All personnel to defensive positions. Security teams mobilize. And then, almost as an afterthought, Frank Horrigan to the detention level. That last part made my blood run cold. They were activating Frank. That meant this was serious. I grabbed my gear and headed for my assigned station, moving through corridors that were suddenly full of armed soldiers rushing in every direction. The confusion was palpable. No one knew how many intruders there were, where they had come from, or what their objective was. Some soldiers thought it was NCR, a Special Forces strike team. Others whispered about Brotherhood of Steel paladins in underwater power armor. A few mentioned rumors of a tribal who had been causing problems on the mainland, but dismissed it as impossible that one person could reach the rig. They were wrong. It was the tribal, the Chosen One. And he had not come alone, but he had come determined. The fighting was concentrated in the lower levels initially. The intruders, whoever they were methodical, working their way up through the facility. Security checkpoints fell one after another. Automated turrets went offline or turned against our forces, reprogrammed somehow. The Enclave soldiers, men trained since birth for combat, were dying. Not in small numbers, but in squads. Entire teams wiped out. I heard fragments over the radio. Someone talking about impossible shots, about weapons that should not exist in tribal hands, about tactics that spoke of military training. And then I heard something that made no sense. The prisoners were free, the Arroyo villagers, the Vault 13 dwellers, people we had been testing the virus on. They were being evacuated. Someone had broken into the detention level and released them. President Richardson sealed himself in his office with his personal guard. Dr. Curling secured the labs, protecting the virus samples and research data. And Frank began hunting. I was not there for most of what happened next, but I heard the stories after, pieced together from survivors and security footage. Frank moved through the lower levels like a force of nature, following the trail of destruction the intruders left behind. He found bodies, Enclave bodies, our people cut down by someone who knew exactly where to shoot, exactly how to kill efficiently. Frank would stop at each one, his head tilting in that unsettling way, processing information with his damaged brain. He encountered the Chosen One in the reactor control room, or rather, the Chosen One encountered him. There are different versions of what happened, but the consistent details paint a clear picture. The tribal was there with companions, people who had joined his cause. They were trying to access the main computer. trying to trigger some kind of cascade failure that would destroy the entire facility. Frank walked in through the main entrance, too large to use the side doors. His plasma cannon was charged and ready, his combat blade drawn. The Chosen One and his allies turned to face him, and for a moment, according to those who saw the security feed, no one moved. They were staring at each other, predator and prey, except neither was sure which was which. Frank spoke first. His voice, mechanically amplified by his helmet, filled the room. "You have gotten a lot farther than you should have. But then, you have not met Frank Horrigan either. Your ride is over, Mutie. Time to die." The Chosen One tried talking, actually tried to reason with Frank, to explain that the Enclave was planning genocide, that millions of innocent people would die if the virus was released. Frank listened, or appeared to listen, then responded with something that perfectly encapsulated everything he was. "Killing your kind is our business, and business is good." The fight that followed was the stuff of legend, though legend is probably too generous a word. Massacre is more accurate. Frank opened fire with his plasma cannon, superheated rounds that could vaporize an unarmored human. The Chosen One's companions scattered, returning fire with everything they had. Gauss rifles, pulse grenades, rocket launchers, weapons that would kill a normal soldier a dozen times over. Frank shrugged them off. His armor, that custom-built monstrosity grafted to his flesh, absorbed hits that would have destroyed a vertibird. He kept firing, kept advancing, methodical and unstoppable. One of the Chosen One's companions went down, caught by a plasma burst that melted through their armor like wax. Then another. Frank was winning, but the Chosen One had done something clever. He had accessed the security systems, turned them against the Enclave. The automated turrets, the ones designed to protect critical areas, they activated, and they recognized Frank as a threat, not because of any malfunction, but because the Chosen One had reprogrammed their target parameters. Suddenly, Frank was taking fire from multiple angles, turrets and companions coordinating their attacks. Even then, he almost won. His armor held against the initial barrage, his reactor compensating for the power drain. He killed another companion, crushed them under his boot, while simultaneously firing at a turret. For a few terrible seconds, it looked like Frank was going to butcher everyone in that room, and then continue hunting through the rest of the facility. Then the Chosen One did something unexpected. He called for help, not from his companions, but from the oil rig's last people who might listen. Enclave soldiers, ones who had started to doubt, who had seen too much and wondered if maybe the Enclave had gone too far. A few of them, not many, but enough, they switched sides, turned their weapons on Frank. The betrayal, if Frank even understood it as such, changed nothing in his behavior. He just added them to his target list, started killing Enclave soldiers alongside the intruders. In his mind, they had become muties the moment they disobeyed orders. They were no longer pure, no longer worthy of life. So he killed them without hesitation, without remorse. The damage accumulated. Pulse grenades shorting out his armor systems, Gauss rifle rounds punching through weakened plating, turrets hammering him from angles he could not defend. His reactor started to fail, unable to keep up with the demand. The drugs that kept his mutated body alive, they stopped flowing properly. Frank began to slow, his movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. He still killed 2 more soldiers before he fell, grabbed one by the throat and squeezed until the vertebrae separated. Shot another point blank with his plasma cannon even as his own armor was failing. He fought until his legs would not hold him anymore, until his systems crashed completely. When he finally went down, when his massive frame hit the deck with a sound like a building collapsing, the reactor room went silent. Everyone stopped shooting, stopped moving, just stared at the thing that had seemed invincible, lying motionless on the floor. Smoke rose from breached plating. Coolant and blood mixed together in spreading pools. For a moment it seemed like it was over. Then Frank moved, his upper body dragging itself forward with one arm because his lower half was not responding. His armor was bisected at the waist, severed by concentrated fire, but he was still alive, still functional, still trying to complete his mission. The Chosen One approached carefully, weapon ready. Frank's helmet turned toward him, tracking the movement. When he spoke, his voice was damaged, distorted by failing systems, but still defiant. "You have not won here. You and your muty bastard friends are going to join me in a big old mushroom cloud send-off. I just triggered the self-destruct." He was laughing, or trying to. A wet, horrible sound that might have been laughter, or might have been his lungs failing. Blood leaked from seals in his armor, mixing with hydraulic fluid and coolant. But his eyes, visible now through a cracked visor, they showed satisfaction. Even in defeat, he thought he had won. The oil rig would explode. The Chosen One and his allies would die. The Enclave's enemies would be eliminated. The work will go on, Frank continued, each word coming harder than the last. You did not do nothing here except seal your own death warrants. Duty, honor, courage, semper fi, those were his last words. The motto of the Marine Corps, or what the Enclave pretended was the Marine Corps. Their claim to military legitimacy in a world where such things no longer mattered. He died believing he had served his country, protected his people, done his duty as a soldier. He died without understanding that he had been a monster, that his life had been a crime against humanity given shape and purpose. I was not there when it happened, but I saw the footage later, watched Frank's head slump forward, watched his arms stop moving, watched the light fade from his eyes, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction at his death, no grief for a fallen soldier, just emptiness. Because killing Frank did not undo what he had done. It did not bring back the families he had murdered. It did not erase the horror he had inflicted on the wasteland. The Chosen One and his allies ran. The self-destruct was real, counting down steadily while they raced through corridors filled with panicking Enclave personnel. President Richardson was dead, killed either in the fighting or by his own hand, depending on who you ask. Dr. Curling had turned traitor, released the virus into the oil rig's sealed atmosphere instead of into the jet streams, killing his own people to stop the genocide. The facility was tearing itself apart, reactors overloading, bulkheads collapsing. I survived because I was near an evacuation point when everything went critical, grabbed a vertibird with a handful of other survivors, and we lifted off just as the oil rig began its final collapse. Looked back and saw the explosions, the fireballs rising into the sky, the structure that had been the Enclave's heart sinking into the Pacific. Everything we had built, everything we had worked toward, gone in minutes. The Chosen One made it out too, got the prisoners, his allies, everyone he had come to save onto a tanker and sailed away before the rig went up. He had done the impossible. One tribal, with help from people we had dismissed as irrelevant, had destroyed the Enclave's master plan and killed the most dangerous weapon we had ever created. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that subscribe button. It tells me someone out there is still paying attention to warnings like these. The days after were chaos. Those of us who survived scattered, some going to Navarro, others disappearing into the wasteland, a few trying to reach the East Coast, where rumor said other Enclave facilities still operated. We were broken, leaderless, our grand vision of reclaiming America reduced to ash and salt water. The virus was destroyed. The research was lost. Frank was dead. Everything we had sacrificed, every moral line we had crossed, it had all been for nothing. But that is not the end of Frank's story. Because even dead, even destroyed, he left a mark on the wasteland that will not fade. The settlements he wiped out, they never rebuilt. The families he murdered, they have no descendants to remember them. The fear he inspired, it lingers still, passed down through stories and warnings. In some places, parents still threaten children with tales of a monster in black armor who comes for those who break the rules, and there are people who glorify him. Former Enclave who talk about Frank like he was a hero, a patriot who gave everything for his country. They sell pieces of his armor, or claim to, on the black market. 50, 100 caps a pop, promising the buyer a fragment of legend. It makes me sick. They remember the power, the efficiency, the unstoppable force. They forget the screaming child, the farmer defending his home, the Deathclaw trying to negotiate peace. Frank Horrigan was the Enclave's greatest success and its most terrible failure. We wanted a weapon that would secure our vision of humanity's future, and we got exactly that. We got a creature so loyal, so single-minded, so utterly dedicated to killing, that it could not be reasoned with, could not be stopped by normal means, could only be destroyed at tremendous cost. We got a walking nightmare that validated every fear the wasteland had about the Enclave's true intentions. The Chosen One could have killed Frank easily earlier if they had encountered him in the wasteland under different circumstances. But on the oil rig, in that final confrontation, Frank had every advantage. Home terrain, support systems, backup from soldiers and turrets, and he still lost. Not because he was weak, but because the Chosen One represented something Frank could never understand. Hope. The belief that people working together, people who cared about each other despite their differences, could overcome even the most terrible monster. I think about Frank often now, wonder what he could have been if someone had helped him when he was young, if the Enclave had treated his psychological problems instead of exploiting them. He could have been a good soldier, maybe even a good man, with proper support and medication and therapy. Instead, they took his worst traits and amplified them, turned his disability into a weapon, made him into something that could only destroy. That is the real horror of Frank Horrigan. Not that he existed, but that we created him. We saw a broken human being and we broke him further. We took his loyalty and twisted it into fanaticism. We took his violence and refined it into genocide. And we did it all while telling ourselves we were the good guys, the last hope of civilization, the pure strain of humanity that would save the world. The years after the oil rig have given me time to think, to process what we did and what it cost. I live in a settlement now, far from anywhere the Enclave used to operate. Changed my name, grew a beard, learned to keep my head down and my mouth shut about my past. Most days, people here think I'm just another wasteland survivor with a drinking problem and nightmares I will not talk about. They are half right, but I cannot escape Frank. Not really. His ghost follows me through every quiet moment. Every time I close my eyes and try to sleep, I see him standing in that corridor on the oil rig, motionless and menacing. I see the security footage of him murdering that family, the casual efficiency of it. I see his bisected body dragging itself forward, still trying to kill even as death claimed him. And I ask myself the same question over and over. Could I have stopped it? Could any of us? The truth is complicated and ugly. Yes, we could have stopped it. At a dozen different points, someone could have said no. When they first identified Frank as psychologically unstable, they could have given him treatment instead of a security clearance. When he had his psychotic incident, they could have imprisoned or executed him instead of sending him to the wasteland. When he was exposed to FEV, they could have put him down humanely instead of seeing an opportunity. At every turn, there was a choice between doing the right thing and doing the expedient thing, and we chose expediency every single time. But here is the harder truth. Most of us never had the power to make those choices. The decisions came from the top, from President Richardson and his inner circle, from the ideology that had been baked into the Enclave since before the bombs fell. We were cogs in a machine designed to produce monsters, and Frank was just the most obvious product of that design. Saying no would have meant being labeled a traitor, which meant joining Frank's target list. So we stayed silent. We followed orders. We told ourselves that someone else would fix it, that surely the people in charge knew what they were doing. They did not. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway because the ends justified the means. Always the ends, always the greater good. Kill 1 million to save 1 billion. Sacrifice morality to preserve humanity. Create a monster to fight monsters. The logic was circular and poisonous, and it infected everything the Enclave touched. I met one of Frank's victims once, years after the oil rig. An old woman living in a raider-fortified settlement, trading medical skills for protection. She had been part of a caravan that Frank attacked in 2240. He killed the guards, killed the traders, killed everyone except her because she had been hiding in a storage compartment. And he either did not see her or did not care enough to check thoroughly. She heard everything, the screaming, the begging, the sound of Frank's blade cutting through bone, and then silence, followed by Frank's voice asking his squad if they should salvage the cargo before returning to base. She told me this story without knowing who I was, what I had been, just making conversation with another wasteland drifter over a bottle of rock gut whiskey. When she finished, she stared into her cup and said something I will never forget. The worst part was not that he killed them. Death is everywhere out here. The worst part was that it meant nothing to him. They died begging for mercy from something that did not understand what mercy was. I wanted to tell her I was sorry, that I had been there, had been part of the system that created Frank, that I carried guilt for every person he killed because my silence enabled it. But I said nothing, just refilled her cup and changed the subject. Because what good would the truth have done? It would not have brought back her friends, would not have healed her trauma, would only have added another target to her list of people to hate. The Enclave fractured after the oil rig. Some went east, joined up with the remnants operating out of Raven Rock and Adams Air Force Base. They lasted another 35 years before the Brotherhood of Steel destroyed them too, ending their bid for continental domination. Some tried to rebuild in the west, small cells operating out of hidden bunkers, but the NCR hunted them down systematically. By 2250, the Enclave as an organization was effectively extinct, reduced to scattered individuals trying to forget what they had been. A few of us tried to make amends, There was a former scientist who dedicated his remaining years to helping supermutants, developing treatments for the Nightkin's schizophrenia caused by stealth boy addiction. An ex-soldier who joined the followers of the apocalypse, teaching wasteland communities how to purify water and grow crops in irradiated soil. Small gestures that could never balance the scales, but gestures nonetheless, trying to add something good to a world we had tried to cleanse with fire and poison. I asked the scientist once, late at night when we were both too drunk to maintain proper operational security, if he thought we could be forgiven. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and said, "Forgiveness is not for us to decide. We did what we did. The wasteland will judge us, and the wasteland does not forget." He was right. The wasteland does not forget. Walk into certain settlements and mention the Enclave. Watch how people react. Fear, anger, hatred. We are the boogeyman. The cautionary tale. The warning about what happens when ideology becomes more important than humanity. And Frank is the ultimate symbol of that. The weapon that could not be controlled. The monster that turned on its creators. The logical endpoint of a philosophy that saw most of humanity as expendable. There are still people who worship what the Enclave represented. I have encountered them in my travels, usually young wastelanders who never experienced the Enclave firsthand and romanticize what we claim to be rather than what we actually were. They talk about restoring order, about pure humanity reclaiming its birthright, about the need for strong leaders willing to make hard choices. When they learn I was Enclave, some of them look at me with reverence, like I am some kind of hero from a better time. I tell them about Frank, tell them everything. The murders, the experiments, the casual cruelty, the absolute certainty that what he was doing was right. I tell them about standing in corridors and feeling his eyes track my movement, knowing that one wrong word could get me classified as a mutie and added to his kill list. I tell them about the farmer and his grandson, about the death clause in Vault 13, about every atrocity Frank committed in the name of preserving pure humanity. Most of them go quiet after that. Some get angry, accuse me of lying or exaggerating. A few, and this is the truly disturbing part, they nod like I have just confirmed their beliefs. Like Frank's brutality was not a warning, but an instruction manual. Those are the ones I worry about. Those are the ones who would build another Enclave if given the chance, who would create another Frank and point him at their enemies. The cycle threatens to repeat, not with the Enclave specifically, but with the philosophy behind it. Every few years, some settlement or faction decides that the wasteland would be better if they were in charge. If everyone who disagreed with them was eliminated, if purity of ideology or genetics or culture was enforced through violence, they start small usually, exiling outsiders, restricting resources to approved groups, treating certain mutations or origins as markers of inferiority. And if no one stops them, they escalate. They always escalate. I have tried to stop some of them. Warned settlements when I saw the signs. Shared intelligence with groups fighting against emerging fascist movements. Sometimes it works. Sometimes people listen to a reformed Enclave officer explaining how the road to genocide is paved with good intentions and classification systems. Sometimes they thank me and adjust course, recognizing the danger before it consumes them. Sometimes they kill the messenger. I have scars from settlements that decided my warning was actually proof that I was the problem, that someone with my history had no right to lecture anyone about morality. They are not wrong exactly. I do not have moral high ground, but I have experience. I know what the endgame looks like. I have seen what happens when you decide that some lives matter less than others. When you create categories of acceptable targets, when you build weapons like Frank and convince yourself you are the hero of the story. The Brotherhood of Steel, they understood this better than most. After they helped destroy the oil rig, after they saw what the Enclave had become, they made changes to their own organization, recognized that their hoarding of technology, their elitism, their willingness to let wastelanders die to preserve their mission, that was a path toward becoming another Enclave. Not every chapter learned the lesson. Some doubled down, became more isolated, more convinced of their superiority. But others opened up, started helping communities, started seeing wastelanders as people worth protecting rather than potential threats. The NCR learned different lessons. They saw the Enclave's centralized authority, its presidential structure, and decided democracy was the answer. Messy, inefficient democracy, where people argued and compromised and sometimes made terrible choices. But at least those choices came from consensus rather than dictate. It is not perfect. The NCR has its own problems, its own imperialism disguised as civilization. But it is harder to create a Frank Horrigan in a system where multiple people have to sign off on every major decision, where there are checks and balances, where citizens can vote out leaders who go too far. I think about what Frank could have been in a different system. In the NCR, his psychological problems would have been identified and treated, or he would have been discharged before he could hurt anyone. In the Brotherhood, his strength would have been valued, but his instability would have kept him from frontline duty, maybe assigned him to logistics or defense where his capabilities could be useful without being dangerous. In any halfway sane organization, Frank would have been a cautionary tale about the importance of mental health screening, not a weapon to be deployed against civilians. But the Enclave was not sane. It was the fever dream of men who survived the apocalypse by hiding in a bunker and convinced themselves that this made them special, that their survival proved their superiority, that they had the right and responsibility to reshape humanity according to their vision. And Frank was the perfect instrument for that vision, because he could not question it, could not doubt it, could only execute it with maximum efficiency. There is a settlement in the far north, built around a pre-war factory that somehow survived mostly intact. They have rules there, strict ones, about who gets to join and what behaviors are acceptable. Nothing explicitly genocidal, but the pattern is familiar. Emphasis on pure bloodlines, whatever that means in a world soaked in radiation, restrictions on who can have children, mandatory genetic testing. When I passed through and heard about their system, I asked to speak with their council. I told them about Frank, told them everything. They listened politely, then informed me that their situation was different, that they were being responsible about preserving the best of humanity, that surely I could see the difference between their careful genetic management and the Enclave's extremism. I asked them what they planned to do with people who failed the genetic tests. They said those people would be encouraged to settle elsewhere. I asked what happened if those people refused to leave. They said that situation had not arisen yet. I left that settlement and never went back. Sent word to the NCR and the Brotherhood about what I had seen. Do not know if anything came of it, but I think about that conversation often. The polite euphemisms, the reasonable tone, the absolute certainty that they were different, that their classification system was scientific rather than ideological, that their exclusions were necessary rather than cruel. It sounded exactly like conversations I had heard on the oil rig, in Enclave briefings, in the commissary over meals. We were always reasonable, always justified, always convinced that this time, this implementation of purity doctrine would be the correct one. Frank never had those conversations. Frank never bothered with justifications or euphemisms. He just killed what he was told to kill. And in his simplicity, in his absolute conviction, he was the most honest expression of what the Enclave believed. Strip away the rhetoric about preserving humanity and rebuilding civilization, and what remained was Frank. Pure violence in service of exclusion. The fist wrapped in ideology, crushing anyone classified as other. They say the Chosen One kept one of Frank's weapons as a trophy, the combat blade, that oversized, serrated monstrosity that Frank used to butcher Deathclaws and people alike. Supposedly it hangs in a place of honor in Arroyo, a reminder of what they overcame, what they defeated. I've never seen it myself, never wanted to. That blade killed so many. Every notch and stain on that metal is someone's last moment, someone's family destroyed, someone's hope extinguished. Displaying it feels wrong to me, but I understand why they do it. They need to remember that monsters can be beaten, that overwhelming force and technological superiority do not guarantee victory. That courage and cooperation can overcome even the most terrible weapons. I wish I could believe that as strongly as they do. Most days I think we just got lucky. If the Chosen One had been slightly slower, if Frank's armor had held up better, if Curling had not turned traitor at the last moment, the oil rig would have deployed the virus and Frank would have survived to see the wastes go silent, and he would have walked through the corpse-strewn world, satisfied that he had completed his mission, never understanding the magnitude of what he had helped accomplish. That is the ultimate tragedy of Frank Horrigan. Not that he was evil, but that he was not. Evil implies choice, implies understanding that what you are doing is wrong and doing it anyway. Frank did not have that capacity. He was a damaged man turned into a damaged weapon, pointed at the world by people who convinced themselves they were righteous. His body count was his own, but the responsibility for creating him, for enabling him, for turning his dysfunction into a military asset that belongs to all of us who stood by and let it happen. I am old now. 67 last month, assuming I've counted the years correctly. My hands shake. My lungs rattle from years of breathing wasteland air and smoking too many cigarettes. I do not have much time left, which is why I am recording this. Someone needs to know the truth about Frank Horrigan. Not the legend, not the propaganda, but the reality. He was the Enclave's most powerful mutant, yes. But more than that, he was our greatest sin. The proof that we had gone so far down a dark path that we could not even recognize the horror we had created. If you are listening to this, if you are part of some organization talking about purity and superiority and necessary sacrifices, I beg you to stop. Look at what you are building. Ask yourself if you are creating the next Frank Horrigan, the next instrument of genocide wrapped in reasonable justifications. Because I promise you, it starts with small steps. Excluding certain groups, classifying people as acceptable or unacceptable, building weapons and telling yourself they will only be used against real threats. And then one day, you wake up and your weapon is killing children, and you realize you have become the monster you thought you were fighting. Frank is dead. The Enclave is broken. The virus was destroyed. But the philosophy that created them, that lives on, it resurfaces every generation in new forms, new names, new justifications. And it will keep resurfacing until we as a species learn the fundamental lesson that Frank's existence should have taught us. There is no such thing as an acceptable genocide. There is no category of human that deserves extinction. There is no purity worth the price of mass murder. We are all contaminated. We are all mutants. We are all just trying to survive in a world that wants us dead. And the only way forward is together, accepting our differences, helping each other despite our flaws. That was the lesson the Chosen One understood, and the Enclave did not. That was why a tribal with improvised allies could destroy the most technologically advanced organization in the wasteland, not because they were stronger, but because they were united by something more powerful than ideology. They were united by the simple belief that all people, mutant or pure or somewhere in between, deserved a chance to live. Frank Horrigan never understood that, could not understand it. His brain had been too damaged, his conditioning too thorough, his worldview too simplified. He died believing he was a hero, a patriot, a soldier doing his duty, and maybe in his own broken way he was. He followed his orders. He protected what he was told to protect. He killed who he was told to kill. He was loyal to the end. But loyalty to a genocidal cause is not a virtue. Following orders to commit atrocities is not duty, and dying in service of evil, no matter how sincerely you believed it was good, does not make you a hero. It makes you a cautionary tale, a warning carved in blood and plasma and shattered bone, a reminder that the road to hell is paved not just with good intentions, but with good soldiers who never questioned their orders. I failed Frank. We all did. We failed him when he was young and needed help. We failed him when he showed signs of instability. We failed him when he was exposed to FEV. We failed him every day we let him continue killing in our name. And ultimately, we failed him by forcing the Chosen One to kill him, to put down a rabid dog we had created and could not control. Frank deserved better than the life he got. The wasteland deserved better than having Frank unleashed upon it. We all deserved better than the system that made Frank possible. I do not know if this recording will change anything. Probably not. People tend to hear what they want to hear, believe what they want to believe. But I needed to say it, needed to leave this testimony before I die. Before the last of us who remember the oil rig are gone, and Frank becomes nothing but legend, stripped of context and consequence. He was real. The people he killed were real. The choices we made were real. And the lessons, God, the lessons are still relevant. Do not create weapons you cannot control. Do not classify people as acceptable casualties. Do not convince yourself that your cause justifies any action. Do not build your own Frank Horrigan and then act surprised when he does exactly what you designed him to do. These should be obvious truths, but they are not. Every generation has to learn them again, usually at terrible cost. Frank Horrigan was 12 feet tall, powered by a fusion reactor, armed with enough firepower to level a town. But in the end, he was just a man. A broken, manipulated, tragic man turned into an instrument of mass murder by people who should have known better. Remember him. Remember what he did. Remember what created him. And for the love of whatever you hold sacred, do not repeat our mistakes. The wasteland has enough monsters. It does not need us making more.